The UFO lore surrounding the city of Roswell is famous throughout the world, but other places have been epicenters of mysterious sightings too. In today's episode, we'll share two stories of towns that experienced alien invasions.
Okay, cool. So you ready to start the show?
Ready to start the show?
Let's do it.
Welcome to Shadowland, everybody. This
Welcome.
is a podcast that shines a spotlight on stories of the supernatural, mysterious, eerie, and unexplained. So basically, weird stuff like ghosts,
Auras,
cryptids,
time travel, black holes,
remote seeing,
other dimensions, stargates,
elves,
elves. I'm gonna do a show on elves.
Nessie, synchronicity,
Astral projection.
Wendigos.
Yeah, Wendigos are good.
So
All
you
that
get
stuff.
the general idea.
Yes.
All the good weird stuff.
Cool. So, do you want to talk about? Do you want to do some introductions and tell everybody who we are and why we're here?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Christina Callery, and about as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in stories of the paranormal, mysterious, and strange. I loved ghost stories, mysteries. I'm a writer, so I would even write my own stories in a notebook when I was a little kid. I'd check all of the ghost books out of the school library that I could find. I read books about the Bermuda Triangle, and I always loved hearing stories from friends. I was also my mom was pretty religious, so I was raised around talk of the supernatural, and I think that definitely contributed to my interest in all of this stuff.
Cool. And I'm Seth Jablon. I'm also very interested in this stuff, just like Christina. And I grew up, always loving like the time life books, Mysteries of the Unknown.
Oh, those are great.
Yeah, the Bigfoot and the Bermuda Triangle and just all that weird stuff. Just really captured my imagination. It made me imagine of a more mysterious world than I learned in school. Where everything's sort of dry and flat and one dimensional, and it really captured my imagination that there was more to this world than we talked about, more to this world than we knew about. And so I just always loved stories around that, with cryptids and aliens in particular. I definitely read a lot of Whitley Strieber, I guess his name is, Communion, and Eric von Daniken and all that ancient alien stuff. I just thought was so cool, and it really opened my mind up as a youngster, and so I've never lost that passion for talking about these things. And I think that's one of the reasons we both wanted to start this podcast, is because we love talking about this stuff with each other. Anytime we hang out and have a glass of wine or something, at some point we're going to start trading stories and
right.
pretty
It
much
always
stay there for
comes
the rest
back
of the night.
to it always comes back to like Mothman stories and near death experiences.
Yes.
And, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, and you and I are both Gen Xers.
Yep.
And so we grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I just have to ask you mentioned the Time Life series.
Yes.
Do you remember those? I think they were, I want to call them index cards, but it was you could order some series of these cards that had all of these mysterious sort of stories on them or information about.
No, I never heard of those. That
Okay,
sounds really cool. Now I want one.
I'm gonna have to look that up. I'm I'm having a flashback.
I don't think I even ever had I think I got my hands on maybe the Bigfoot one and maybe another one about the pyramids or something, but I never really had the full set. I don't even know how I got my hands on it. I think I would beg my mom to buy it, and she never would do it, but somehow maybe at a doctor's office or something, or I came across a copy of it. But I'd love to see those things again. They were so well done, and I feel like there was just some article recently about. I guess there's a very strange story about how it sort of that whole thing came about at Time Life, because it's an odd topic I think for them to even cover, and so maybe we'll even do an episode about that.
Yeah, I would love to. That'd be awesome. And also, one thing both of us really want is to hear your stories.
Yes.
We love hearing actual true stories from real people. A lot of these things that we're going to talk about on the show have been covered before by other podcasts, but it's really amazing when you can hear a firsthand account from somebody who maybe even hasn't shared it with anyone before.
Yeah, totally. And as we talk about these topics, we're not necessarily trying to like, catalog all the great stories that are already out there, but this is about a discussion for us. This is about, talking about, how we see this phenomenon, what we think is going on. And it's really about, getting into the subject and not necessarily trying to prove anything or draw any conclusions, but there's something about discussing it and talking about it with each other and sharing that helps us see into it further and what we sort of get out of it as human beings. And so
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, as much as I'm fascinated by all of this, I still have a strong skeptical streak, and so
Yes, you're going to play the
I
skeptic.
love.
I'm going to be the guy who believes everything.
Right. Okay. We've got our roles defined.
Yeah.
But basically finding evidence and delving into things further and really trying. I mean, I think that'll be, just kind of like helpful. I mean,
Totally.
I hate to use the word journey, but
Yeah,
it kind of
it'll
is
be
a journey, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Figuring out what you believe and kind of looking into things and keeping an open mind the whole time.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna go first, and maybe we should talk a little bit about the theme today, because today's theme is.
Yeah, I mean it's towns. I mean we wanted to talk about aliens, and we wanted something that was like, centric to places that people live. Like we're in different towns, and we talk about how, a lot of stories happen to people, a lot of abduction stories and alien encounters, but they also happen to places, and really throughout history. I mean, there's, all sorts of lore that surround, places, peoples at a certain time. And so, some of these, alien events, they happen to, specifically to towns at different times. And so we just thought that would be a cool place to start for us.
Absolutely. And it's kind of the granddaddy of all of the weird stories out there. I mean, aliens, how can we not start with that?
That's right.
So, my story, actually, before I get into it, I just wanted to share a little side story with you, Seth.
Okay.
Somebody sent me something from the New York Post, and the headline is "The Pentagon Finally Admits It Investigates UFOs." I'm just going to read the first blurb. But in a statement provided exclusively to the Post, a Department of Defense spokesman said a secret government initiative called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, quote, did pursue research and investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena.
Wow, that's pretty crazy. That's huge that they would finally acknowledge it. Even just acknowledging that they're investigating it,
right,
is something.
Right.
Because it means that there's something to investigate.
Exactly. I mean, this is the New York Post, but still.
Well, yeah, and I mean, also recently, I definitely feel like I've read some stories from the Air Force where they're finally acknowledged, like, oh yeah, we definitely see UFOs on the regular, like the pilots and people who track sort of foreign objects and stuff. I think they even released some like video of them like describing what they were seeing and sort of like tripping out over like how crazy it was. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So.
Awesome. You'll have to send me those. I got to check it out.
I will.
Okay, so my story is the Michigan UFO invasion of 1966. Cool. And this one it's kind of like, it's an origin story of a UFO cliche that we've all heard. I'm not going to give it away yet. You'll have to listen to find out. But it takes place kind of centered around Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it's spread out from there. So in March of 1966, dozens of UFO sightings were reported by Southeast Michigan residents over the course of a few days. And this is just sort of like the very beginnings on that day. It started with kind of a foreshock. In the early morning of March 14th, 1966, Washtenaw County Sheriff's deputies saw strange lights in the sky moving at fantastic speeds. The lights were also spotted by officers 40 miles away in Ohio, and at the Selfridge Air Force Base, which was 50 miles east. So this is just the beginning stages. A few days later, on March 20th, things really got crazy. So earlier in the evening, the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office received reports of an unidentified flying object that actually landed in a wooded, swampy area in Dexter Township, which is just outside Ann Arbor. And it's a pretty rural area today, and it was had to be even more so back then. So deputies dispatched to the scene took a statement from this truck driver, and his name was Frank Manor. And he was renting a farmhouse nearby. And he said that he was on his porch and he went out there and he was trying to calm his dogs down because they were barking like crazy. And all of a sudden, he sees this bright object shaped like a football and about the size of a small car. And it's hovering over the swamp. And so he and his son Ron then went into the swamp to investigate it. I'm not sure I would be brave enough to do that. I don't know if you would, Seth.
I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think I'd like give it a try, maybe.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, it probably is pretty terrifying. Though,
once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
But, so anyway, here's his quote. He says, "We got to about 500 yards of the thing. It was sort of shaped like a pyramid with a blue-green light on the right-hand side, and on the left, a white light. I didn't see an antenna or portal. The body was like a yellowish coral rock and looked like it had holes in it. Sort of like if you took a piece of cardboard box and split it open. So it must have been perforated or something. You couldn't see it too good because it was surrounded with heat waves like you see on the desert. The white light turned a blood red as we got close to it, and Ron said, 'Look at that horrible thing.'" Which I find that's a really interesting quote to me because
Yeah, I mean, it sounds cool looking, but based on what he's
it does sound cool, but it also, but he perceived it to be sort of ominous and like a threat right away. So it apparently hovered over the swamp for about 4 hours, and he wasn't the only one who saw this. There were dozens of other locals, including police officers, who witnessed it before it flew away. So that's the night of the 20th. And then the next night, more than 80 students at Hillsdale College saw floating lights in a nearby swamp. And there were, like, all told, up to 100 witnesses in the Ann Arbor area, including Dexter. And the reports actually spread out from there. And so they started getting reports from other areas, and that even went into Sylvania, Ohio. So it spanned 3 counties.
Wow, that's pretty.
And 2 states.
Pretty big, yeah.
Yeah. So then, okay, the government, there's all these reports. Government has to do something about it. So the Air Force brings in their expert, and it is a guy named J. Allen Hynek to investigate. And at this point, there's a state of near hysteria. That's how he described it. And I just want to stop here. I actually emailed you a couple of pics of him so you can get a good mental picture.
Oh, okay.
Of Hynek. So he was actually like a legit astronomer and professor. He was a real scientist, and he'd been recruited to act as a scientific advisor to UFO studies being done by the Air Force. And this went on from about 1947 to 1969. And these projects were Project Sign, Project Grudgeon, and then the famous one that everybody's probably heard of, Project Blue Book. And what is cool and interesting about him is that he started out as a skeptic. So he didn't really buy any of it. He's brought in to be this advisor, but then later, after he's reviewed hundreds of these cases over the years, he actually became a believer. And there was a turnaround in his opinions after Project Blue Book ended. He actually would finally make public statements about taking the UFO question more seriously.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and actually, like, he was the guy who created the close encounter classification system.
Oh, right. Okay, I know what you're talking about now. Yes.
So in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he actually has a cameo because he's kind of this UFO rock star.
Right, that's so crazy. That this classification system is obviously part of that movie and now obviously pop culture. That he was the one who sort of created that system. Like,
right.
Yeah, it's like
he also created
he
also created something else, which you'll see like later on in the story. He presented a statement on UFOs before the United Nations General Assembly like later on in 1978. So this he was like Mr. UFO. But back in 1966, he comes in and he does his very best to investigate during this crazy media circus that's happening. There are reporters, there are people hanging around in the Dexter swamp trying to contact the aliens. There was one thing I read about some guy like using his car headlights to try to do Morse
I
code,
like that guy.
music playing, like, I like him too. Um, so reporters are mobbing the witnesses, and this serious like government official scientist Hynek guy has to compete with them, and he's under pressure to figure this all out fast too.
Yeah.
It's like, what's going on here?
Right. They want a quick answer to something that's like obviously pretty disturbing, especially at that time.
Exactly. So on March 25th, which is only like 5 days later, he holds a press conference in Detroit, and over 60 reporters from every major news outlet are there. And his explanations, though, are kind of a letdown. They're sort of boring. He's like bringing up, oh, maybe it was like the moon or the stars. And then here's where the famous phrase comes from. In the Dexter area, he said that the lights may have been caused from swamp gas from the local marshes.
Right.
And that's where we get the whole swamp gas thing from.
That's crazy. Yeah, it's so funny. It's like the more like, the more out there the event, the harder it is for us to like integrate it into our worldview, the more ridiculous I feel like the explanations become, like this whole town is seen, including police officers have seen these things flying around. It's like, I don't know what it is. I guess like swamp gas then? Like,
and I mean, how often do people see swamp gas anyway? I mean,
how do you
is this
see
a thing?
swamp gas?
Is it
Is that
really
a
a
thing
thing
to see? I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know either. We should look into that.
Yeah.
It could be a swamp gas episode.
Yeah.
But like reporters thought it was ridiculous, and they latched onto the swamp gas thing, and it became really blown out of proportion, kind of a joke. That this is the excuse they're giving.
Yeah.
Or the explanation. But he really wasn't claiming that the swamp gas was the whole answer. He didn't have a whole lot of time. He was really hindered by the media chaos that was going on. And, he did his best. And he just said it could be in Dexter, for example. Maybe these lights were caused by this natural phenomenon. But it didn't really answer people's questions.
Right.
And what is interesting is that local authorities didn't dismiss the witnesses' accounts, and they kind of pressed on. And the Washtenaw County Sheriff, his name was Douglas Harvey, actually asked for a top-level investigation and challenged the Air Force's conclusions about the swamp gas.
Interesting.
And there was also this police beat reporter named Bill Tremmel, who really went after the story with gusto, and he interviewed lots of witnesses, coverage of the police operations. He totally went in there and was investigating, what the government officials were saying and their explanations. And he was really trying to get at the heart of it. And it was never solved. And to this day, nobody really has a good explanation for this. But several decades later, there was new evidence that came out in an interview by Douglas Harvey, the sheriff, and it was given to the Ann Arbor News. And he said that when he and Dr. Hynek were talking in the sheriff's office back then in 1966, and Dr. Hynek actually admitted to him that he didn't know what the witnesses had seen, but he felt like it was worth further investigation. And then he leaves the room, goes to make a call to Washington, and when he comes back, he announces the sightings were due to swamp gas. So
wow.
Somewhere in that time frame, he completely switched gears and changed his story.
After that phone call, like obviously there was some
After the
connection
phone call
or something. Yeah.
Someone
told him to say something or not say something or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, must be. So, here's his quote. He says, he tells me 1 minute he has no idea what it is. Then he makes one phone call to Washington and comes out and gives a statement that it's swamp gas. Very strange. And over 50 years later, still unsolved. And that is the story of the Michigan UFO invasion of 1966.
Wow, that's really cool. Like, yeah, I feel like you take for granted, some of these sayings that we have, like flying saucers and stuff like that, and they all have an origin somewhere.
Right.
Somebody said it at some point, or and yeah, it's interesting.
And it's funny that it actually was that phrase was kind of viewed skeptically at the time too.
Right, right. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, my story actually has something sort of like that, and I don't know if it's a origin story, but it's definitely a classic.
Cool.
Yeah, so maybe I don't know if you're ready for me. Maybe I'll jump right
I'm
into that.
totally ready.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter, or
Oh.
the Kelly Kentucky goblins. Have you heard of this at
Oh my
all?
God, no, but I
Okay, well
love
this
that
is a
goblins. We
yeah
hadn't even talked about
yeah, goblins isn't
goblins.
even on our list, but yeah. So this one, I guess it probably is an origin story. I don't know that for sure, but we'll definitely get to how and why that might be an origin story too. But yeah, Kelly, Kentucky is home to one of the most well recorded, I guess, documented encounters that happened to a very particular family on a very particular night. And it all started on August 21st, 1955. So this is all sort of like later. This is all sort of recorded and recounted, but it basically all starts with them sort of bursting into a police station and telling them this like crazy story. And basically, it all begins at 7 p.m. On a farmhouse where there's several adults, several children living. And it starts with Billy Ray Taylor has gone down to the well to get some water, and he quickly comes running back to the house, talking about seeing this, what he called a flying saucer, or I think at one point a flying tub that
A
had sort
flying
of,
tub?
yeah, that had sort of landed in the backyard. I mean, these are, this is a farm, so it's like it's sort of down this hill and sort of pretty far away from him, but he said he saw this silvery object that was really bright, and it had an exhaust of all the colors of the rainbow, which I really liked. I thought that was such a
Ooh,
cool image. But
his UFO is kind of cooler sounding than mine.
yeah, totally, totally. It doesn't sound horrible, but a tub that flies through the sky and leaves a
A
rainbow. It
rainbow
sounds pretty
tub.
cool. So that's when it started, and so at some point a little later in the evening, around 8, they actually see this sort of like weird sort of glowing color coming across this field in front of their house, and sort of comes into focus what they describe as a little shiny green man is approaching the house.
A shiny green man?
Yes, shiny green. And he describes him as 3 foot tall with huge eyes like saucers that are far apart, set in his head, and they glowed with a yellowish light, and his whole body sort of glowed all over. That's what he's saying. It's like kind of shiny and green. It's described as having these huge hands with long fingers with like talons at the end, and the arms that extended almost down to the ground, very long and thin. Which
Whoa.
as yeah, isn't that crazy? Which as he sort of got closer, he raised up over his head like he was being robbed or something. Like don't shoot, almost, like just sort of walking across the yard with his arms raised, and he had these little tiny little legs, which they also described as not having any knees. So it's just kind of like walking with these stiff little legs and
Whoa.
these arms up, and it's not saying a word. And I think
Uh,
throughout the entire encounter, I don't think they speak at all. So yeah, so thing starts walking towards them across the yard. Obviously, they're freaking out. It's 1955, Kentucky, and so like any good Kentuckian immediately goes for the gun, like, grabs a shotgun, or I think it's a shotgun, and shoots it off as a warning. And I think that kind of makes it a little skittish. It's not real. They don't really ever seem that plussed about anything that's happening. But I think it does sort of leave, but then very shortly just comes right back. And I think as it's coming back, he takes a shot at it and knocks it down. And the way
Whoa.
they described how it affects them is it didn't seem to affect, but it did knock them over. But he said they flipped in the air, almost like flipped, head over, feet overhead, backwards, and then got back up and started walking.
Some kind of like gymnastic.
But weirder,
Like,
like there's other just times where he said they shot one, say, out of a tree, for instance, and it like floated down to the ground. So instead of
oh.
like falling, these things don't like fall; they sort of float, which is very weird. Like just trying to picture that in your
Well,
mind.
I mean, n- there's nothing about this that isn't weird.
Yeah, totally right. So far, it's like yeah, it's pretty bizarre. Just like the descriptions of everything. But yeah, just like I mean, you can imagine, and so they keep shooting at these things, and like I said, it knocks them down. They flip over. Sometimes they run away back into the darkness, and then just simply come back a little bit later. But it's definitely not, the gunshots definitely aren't deterring them. And so they leave and then they come back. They keep popping up sort of in the window, like looking into their house. And they later say like nothing about them actually seemed like they were being very aggressive, except for the fact that they were little green creatures poking their heads into their house, which you just nobody's going to
Right.
like that, especially out in some a country farm in Kentucky in 1955. They're not going to stand for it. So
And they were really drawn to this house.
yeah, apparently, I guess that their behavior was described as intensely curious. So, and I think as each time they pop back up, they shoot him and they like sort of run away. And I think at one point they stop shooting because they realize it's not really having any effect on them.
They've got some kind of protection.
Some sort of protection or something,
Force
something about
field.
him. Yeah, something about him. I think they described as some of the gunshots hitting their clothing. I think they said they had some like shiny suits on that made like metal sounds. So I don't know if there was like even penetrating them, or maybe they had some sort of like weird protective suit on. Who knows?
Okay.
But they also notice at some point that every time they reappear from some dark spot in the yard. And every time they turn on a light, they don't really like to go into the lights. It's something about the lights sort of deter them. So later when the cops come and are searching for these things, I think one of them says, well, of course you didn't find any, you can't see them in the light. You can only see them in the dark, that they kind of like
You know,
glow with this inner illumination.
I feel like that's just not a good sign.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Glowing, don't like the lights.
Don't like the
Yeah.
lights. Mm,
But
mm,
again, not non-aggressive, just seem to be super, super curious.
okay.
So I think at that point they finally leave them alone. And I think now they decide to go to the police station and, tell the cops about it. Cops obviously don't really believe them. They think it's maybe a hoax. I think some of their other family members show up at some point and it's like, oh, this is somebody's playing a trick or something like that. And so I think the cops come back and maybe look a little bit, but then leave. And so the next encounter is at 2:30 a.m. that Monday morning. So they come back. Once again, I think one pops up in the window and they shoot a hole through the screen, at it. And I think again they sort of keep coming, don't seem very deterred, but eventually do then go. And so this thing has been an all-night ordeal for these people, and I think eventually they're just like, we're fucking out of here. So I think they like pack up their stuff and go. But this was heavily investigated. Like I said, for at least a while, this was or may still be one of the most well documented encounters because investigators came afterwards, the police came. I think the Air Force under Project Blue Book, you mentioned Project Blue Book, came, and they weren't able to prove anything, but they also found no signs of a hoax.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think one of the funny things I read in one of the newspapers was, they said no one was drinking. I thought that was just such a funny, like, like,
Yeah, I
yeah, go
I
ahead.
find myself wishing I could be a fly on the wall and just like see that go down when they try to report this.
Yes, but just like the supposition that getting drunk is going to make you have a sustained 8-hour collective hallucination of the same, very same
Of
creature.
little green glowing goblin guys.
Yes. And so what's also interesting is they separately, during the sort of post-investigation, they go through and they talk to each individual family member that saw them and work with a sketch artist to draw what they saw. And when you look at the sketches, they look almost exactly the same. So like if this was some sort of hallucination, it's just like, it's fairly far-fetched that they were just sort of seeing something that they were mistaken about. And for instance, I think now some current UFOologists put forward a theory of saying that it was owls, which
Owls,
which is so ridiculous. Yeah. Like, I mean, well, first of all, this is a family living in the country in Kentucky. They fucking know what owls look like.
They know what owls look like, for sure.
But then also that anybody would mistake, a feathered, bird for a little green man is also ridiculous. And I just
walks with his arms straight up in the air.
Yeah, exactly. And they were like, "Oh, it's probably an owl because it floated." I'm like, "That's the best that's the best you got." And I just feel like owls are out there just like taking all kinds of flack for like bullshit that people can't process.
Right. Like the Mothman, right?
Like the Mothman, for instance. Yeah, like I was actually in the TNT area, and an owl actually did fly over our car. You know what? It didn't look like a 6-foot-tall reptilian creature with glowing red eyes.
Or a little green guy.
Green guy. Yeah, I just feel like these owls are out there just like minding their own business, and we're blaming things like murders on them, like like the staircase murders where couldn't possibly just be some narcissistic sociopath that got angry and drunk and killed his wife. No, it's a fucking owl flew down.
Owls can't catch a break these days.
I know. I feel like any minute some like documentary is going to come out. Like, guess what? We figured it out. Like JFK was shot actually by an owl. It flew up to the book depository and took a shot and then flew away. So I just thought that was like of all explanations, kind of like your swamp gas, explanation. It's exactly ridiculous to suggest it. And try telling these people, I feel like no matter what the sort of zeitgeist of the age is, whatever, the intelligentsia say, whatever they put, forward in the newspaper or textbooks or whatever, people still have these experiences no matter what. No matter what anyone says, people have these experiences. And then there's always these people that come afterwards and, want to tell you what you saw. But to these people, they know what they saw. They saw little green men come flying down in a saucer, and they had a sustained encounter with them like all night long. And so I don't know if it's the origin of, little green men from outer space, but I have a feeling it is, or at least is one of the larger examples of it. Certainly one that, became very famous at the time.
Oh, okay.
So that's not a definitive one. I'm, definitely not doing serious fact checking on this stuff, but I have a feeling that it's certainly one of the biggest ones that where these aliens are sort of described as little green men, very often,
green, yes.
Gray or, other colors or whatever. But yeah, so that is the close encounter at Kelly. Yeah.
Fascinating. I've never heard that before. So do they have any conclusions, or what are like some of the theories out there about what this could have been?
Well, that's pretty much it. Like it's owls. I think they said they thought they saw phosphorescent moss growing on a fence. Mm-hmm. It's just just stuff like that. It's not really.
I kind of feel like it's one of those times when it's either crazy or making shit up or it happened.
Right. Yeah, there's no middle road of like, well, what is this that they clearly experienced something. And so because we can't deal with the idea that the face value of what they saw, it's completely rejected. Instead of saying, okay, look, just acknowledging that this happened to these people isn't, admitting or acknowledging or proving that there's alien life. Certainly it's a far cry from that. But the in-between could be at least, acknowledging that they had this experience and that we can't explain it and that we may not have an explanation for it that's like, fits into our current scientific view of, this planet and this universe. Cool. So, so
Well, that
that
was
was
cool.
the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter, aka the Kelly Goblins.
I love that they're called goblins.
Yeah,
I
and
feel like we should bring goblins
oh,
back. They're
Gremlins. I think there were also Kelly Gremlins.
gremlins.
But
Yeah.
yeah, there's actually I got a lot of this from from newspapers, but there's also a book or a report created by Isabel Davis and David, I'm gonna butcher his name, Blocher, and it's called Close Encounter at Kelly, and it's extremely detailed. Like I said, they literally they go through the whole story, they recount, they interview, they talk to the cops. It's an extensive study. They draw diagrams and stuff of what happened there. So there's definitely more. There's definitely more to get into there if anyone is interested.
Cool. I'm interested.
Cool.
I'll check it out.
Yeah. All right. So so I guess that's our first episode. I mean,
It's our
you want to talk
first
about
podcast.
new stories that we want to hear from people, stuff we're going to do in the future?
Yeah, so I think we gave you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to do in the future, which is a lot of stuff in the up front. But next time we're going to do near-death experiences, and I think for this time, I mean, I don't know about you, but I would love to hear alien stories or UFO stories.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, we can't put them in this episode, but we'll definitely. I mean, this won't be the last time we do an alien themed episode, and so send us your stories about aliens. We'll try to also announce upcoming podcasts, upcoming themes that we'll definitely get stories for, and if we get them, we'll read them. We'll read them as a part of the podcast, as a part of that episode. So, we have an email address for that, right?
Yes, we do. It's shadowlandpodcast@gmail.com.
Great.
So send your stories.
Yeah, send us your stories, and I guess we'll talk soon.
Yes, talk soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.